There's not a whole lot of information regarding the escalation of the First Contact War. It is mostly utilised within the games as a minor piece of world building meant to establish the tense social and political standing of the Systems Alliance amongst the galactic community. But what if it weren't that simple? Greetings spacefarers, I'm Michael, and welcome to MTJ Disorder's Mass Effect Lore, a passion piece on all things Mass Effect. If you're into science fiction gaming and other action adventures, then go ahead and subscribe to the channel and like this video for more. As discussed in the latest episode in this series, the First Contact War was essentially a sequence of misunderstandings and blunders from both parties involved. But I've often wondered, given the uncertainty behind the cause of hostilities and the somewhat questionable motivations behind the leadership of the Turian forces, should the incident have arisen at all? This is part 5 of the history of the Systems Alliance, where we will try to further break down the complex circumstances surrounding humanity's first encounter with an intelligent alien civilization, and hopefully answer the question, could the First Contact War have been avoided? In order to start unravelling this question, we must first establish why there was even a need for hostilities to begin with, and to understand that, we need to go back in time, to when the Roman Empire was still being ruled by its founding emperor. Whilst Octavian Augustus Caesar was ironically ushering in an unprecedented era of peace for ancient Europeans, the Citadel Council were effectively inciting their very own First Contact War. In the year CE 1, the practice of activating dormant mass relays was still highly unregulated within Council space. Not that there wasn't any form of procedure, it just wasn't considered to be a dangerous pursuit at the time, or at least not one which presented dangers too difficult for the Council to handle. In fact, given the alarming rate at which the Council was losing regions of the galaxy to worlds choosing the autonomy of the Terminus systems, exploration was openly encouraged. That was, however, until a team of Solarian explorers would vanish sometime that year without a trace, not long after activating a relay that connected to a vast and unexplored area of the galaxy. Though the Solarian explorers would never be heard from again, it wasn't long before the Council learned of the cause of their disappearance: first contact with an aggressive insect-like species known as the Rachni. This would lead to a conflict lasting over 3 centuries, resulting in a near-catastrophic spread of the Rachni throughout the galaxy. It would have been disastrous were it not for the drastic measure of arming and uplifting the Krogan to fight and eradicate them, an action which also had an adverse trickle-on effect of its own. In essence, this seemingly menial action of activating a dormant relay caused centuries of strife for the Citadel, leading the Council to re-evaluate its policies on dormant relay activation. The details of said policies are scant, but what is important to note is the severely illegal status of the newly founded law were it to be broken. Activation of relays that link to unexplored territory was now expressly forbidden, unless performed meticulously by the Council itself, and any unsanctioned attempts were to be dealt with swiftly. So with all of that being said, was the incident involving Relay 314 really all that unreasonable? From the Turians' perspective, the galaxy could very well have been on the brink of another galactic disaster were the Alliance left to continue activating relays. But as far as the Alliance were concerned, they were merely expanding their knowledge and exploring the frontiers of their civilization. They had literally no way of knowing there was even a law to be broken. But therein lies the issue. The Systems Alliance for a few years now had irresponsibly allowed their brawn to outgrow their brains, and it's remarkable that they hadn't run into trouble sooner. Realistically, the Systems Alliance should have been activating relays with similar levels of caution, especially considering that at the time, the only intel we had on what dangers to expect was that somehow the civilization that appeared to precede our own had all but been eradicated. It doesn't immediately mean a great threat was out there. The Protheans could have wiped themselves out for all we knew. But there we go again with that saying, for all we knew. The fact that we as a species were still in our infancy with a clear understanding that we had barely scratched the surface of what there was to know should have had us taking a more precautionary approach. But it didn't. Like a child playing with fire, we charged into the darkness of night with reckless abandon, blissfully unconcerned with what might be hiding in the shadows. It could be argued, however, that the Turians, on the other hand, would have known better and should have taken a more measured assessment. But in all honesty, I think the Alliance absolutely deserved to be scolded without warning when they were first encountered. The Turians knew what the dangers were, and doing everything within their power to put a stop to Relay 314 from being activated as swiftly as possible was the correct course of action. It was drastic and resulted in casualties, but the risks far outweighed what the Council likely considered acceptable losses. I think that most who argue against this would likely suggest that attempting to make contact would have been more prudent. It would have been more peaceful, absolutely. But again, considering the threat that unchecked relay activation posed, could Citadel forces really afford to spend significant reaction time waiting for a response? I would imagine that the majority of policing actions taken against unauthorized relay activations were largely met with force anyway, given that most with the capacity to break this law were likely aware of what they were doing: mercenaries, belligerent non-council species such as the Turians, and even members of the Terminus systems. Any one of these factions, when met with a Turian task force whilst being up to no good, would likely fight or just simply run away. With the Systems Alliance, I think they merely found themselves being an unfortunate statistic in this situation, a first contact species also breaking a law they were unaware of. So no, I don't think opening a dialogue right away would have changed much. After all, if the Alliance were just a child in this situation, how often do children like being told what not to do? The Turians understandably but regrettably acted with a doctrine of fire first and talk later. Only, the talk later part never occurred. When the Alliance forces at Shang-Chi returned to enact retribution, now with zero threat of the relay being activated, no attempt at communication was made by either side. The Alliance acted as you would expect in this situation, but why did the Turians, knowing that the policing action had been successful, not attempt to now open communications? There's a couple of possible explanations, with the most commonly accepted reason being the Turians simply weren't equipped to make first contact. Imagine you are responding to a call that a bunch of ruffians are breaking the law with their little spaceships trying to turn on the gigantic forbidden space engine. You arrive and successfully use intimidation tactics to scare them off. Job well done. Time to go home to the wife. Then suddenly the ruffians show back up with a heavily armed navy with the intention of delivering a message of "F around and find out." Now, this is where that breakdown of communication I spoke about last time comes into play. The responsible thing for the Turians to have done in this situation would be to avoid escalation, maintain a defensive posture, keep the relay protected, and then send a formal request to the Council for a first contact team. But that's not what happened. Instead, the Turians engaged the Alliance and got their asses handed to them. The humans were now embittered to this unknown assailant, but of course they let the dust settle and chose to think rationally about how to proceed now that they had defended themselves. Right? Wrong. Instead, the Alliance strapped nuclear warheads to a bunch of probes and sent them into Turian space. You know, as you do. Now, this wasn't meant to be an aggressive action, it was merely intended to gather intel with the purpose of detonating the nukes in order to scuttle the probes. But nonetheless, no matter how you try to spin this, you have now sent warheads into the territory of a retreating enemy. Not the wisest decision. But fear not, now it's up to the Turians to explore a peaceful resolution. Surely they believe the Council must be told about this escalation. No, this is our mess, it's up to us to solve it. Let's bombard their colony into oblivion and occupy it. That'll teach them to stop trying to activate this relay. There's a bit of a pattern here. Something along the lines of, "Soldiers! He started it!" And I think this could be a good place to stop. We have our answer as to whether or not the conflict could have been avoided. The answer is yes, if at any turning point the leadership that had the upper hand would have just simply chose to de-escalate. I'd like to think that at some point the Turian police supervisor in charge would have shown up and taken over with a cooler head.
Incorrect.
An uncomfortable truth is that the First Contact War likely wouldn't have happened if anyone but the Turians were investigating Relay 314. The Turian hierarchy are a very militaristic and nationalistic society. I hesitate to say fascist, but there is a huge emphasis on military service, strength, and superiority in their culture. The reason they never offered to open a dialogue with the humans after they retaliated is simply because the officers in charge of the task force probably didn't want to. Suffering a defeat at the hands of the fledgling force from Shang-Chi surely resulted in subordinates having to explain to their superiors that they got beat by a navy that has existed for only a couple of decades. Proving to their command that they had control of the situation at this point likely required nothing short of complete subjugation of the Systems Alliance. It's no secret that even as members of the Citadel Council, the Turian hierarchy have, quote, client races within their society, and adding another one by force probably would have actually been received quite well by high-ranking generals, and even possibly by the Primarch himself. It's only when the conflict reaches proportions that ultimately rivaled what it was initially started to prevent that cooler heads began to speak up, and I should hope from both sides, but there isn't really any evidence of that. When the Turians' council liaison came to check up on the progress of the relay policing action, only to be told, "Yeah, about that, we're going to need to go to war." He probably thought to himself, "Neat. Only, I can't go back and tell the council that, so maybe we should de-escalate before this gets out of control." "No! Our pride is at risk! We love war!" Please? It'll be really awkward for me when I have to go into work on Monday and tell them. Okay. And so in steps the rest of the council, and that's that. The First Contact War absolutely could have been avoided with conventional thinking, but the scenario was far from conventional. It was a culmination of 1800 years of events that shaped a policy of overcaution and led two individual factions into a dispute that was nothing more than peacocking in retrospect. So, war basically. Speaking of in retrospect, the true First Contact War realistically was avoided. What the Turians call the Relay 314 incident was never able to reach the heights it could have. It could have resulted in a lot of large-spread devastation and likely the subjugation or even annihilation of the human race, but alas, it never got that far. But what if it was never supposed to? I have a pretty wild theory as to why the First Contact War couldn't be avoided. Before the Rachni War, the Council laws around relay activation being more lax would have likely meant that galactic civilization was advancing very quickly, and if that was a problem due to higher mass relay network access, who would happen to have the means to slow that process down? Oh yeah, these guys! When Commander Shepard speaks to the Rachni Queen on Noveria, she makes it very clear that aggressive behaviour in the Rachni Wars was not only something she didn't understand, but also something that she explains was not entirely under their control. What she describes of the genetic memory she has sounds an awful lot like Reaper indoctrination. So perhaps the Reapers noticed something about the trajectory of galactic civilization that wasn't predictively beneficial for the cycles, and so they interfered to course correct. By causing the Rachni War, the Reapers indirectly changed three significant events, and here's what I think is the reason why. Citadel society was advancing too quickly, and unbeknownst to the Reapers why, the Asari were leading the way. This being a result of Prothean interference, it clearly was not by Reaper design. This progress had to be mitigated somehow, so causing a war that would lead to reduced relay activity would also be an efficient way to slow down this unintentional advancement. The war also happened to have the side effect of setting back Council space by causing widespread damage and introducing another problem that would eventually fix itself, the Krogan. By the end of the Krogan Rebellion, this potential future nuisance to the Reapers had been sterilized, and after all of this has happened, the Council space that remains is fundamentally different, insular, more isolated, guarded, suspicious, and cautious. But what has this to do with the First Contact War? Well, the final variable the Reapers needed to affect was human advancement. They needed humanity to be the apex of this cycle, and so what better way to get them catapulted to the forefront of galactic civilization than to have them introduced to the galaxy through a dramatic and paradigm-shifting first contact. The Rachni War not only resulted in eventual conflict between Turians and humanity, it almost perfectly mirrored it. Insidious. And subtle. So no, the First Contact War could not have been avoided. It happened because they allowed it. And it ended because they demand it. Thanks for watching.
I should go.